I wanted to ground this by starting with the big series that you co-edited, Kinship. And I'm starting with that because I think it's might be quite a new idea to people who might be, say, interested in nature or like being connected to the earth, but then don't really know how to reorient themselves and reconnect to the earth and kind of explore a different relational way of living and being. So I wanted you to kind of share with us a little bit about what you broadly define kinship to be, maybe sharing one or two stories that you've recently resonated with or thought back about for whatever reason in recent months. So that's how we will start.
Totally. So the kinship project began, I mean, the seeds of it were kind of planted with the ways that certain entities, natural entities like rivers and forests and even mountains sometimes were being recognized as persons in legal context. So in certain countries, and New Zealand being a prominent one where this happened in 2017 when the Whanganui River was recognized as a person with rights that could be defended in the court. You know, if there were pollution or if it was abused in certain ways, then there would be the Maori people who were going to be the caretakers of it, but they arranged this bicultural agreement with the New Zealand government, recognizing the personhood of that river. So I think that that's where those seeds got planted, because to think of, we don't usually think of persons as the conventional way of thinking about persons is to think of humans or to make them equivalents. But there's actually a really strong stream of thinking and conceptualizing persons in a lot of different cultures where there are non-human persons. Person just meaning another being that displays agency and will, and that one needs to learn to respect or be in good relation with. And so from that, we started to really talk about what kinship is and what kinship means and what it means to be kin with these other non-human persons. We wanted at the outset to really not define kinship as simply a genetic connection. Obviously, we're biologically connected to other creatures, and evolutionarily speaking, you know, we share in this sort of great tree of life, or strawberry bush, as Mary Midgley once put it, you know, a more spreading and lateral branching bush of life, if you will. But we wanted to really highlight how kinship is about how we engage with the world, how we relate to a world that's wildly alive with all sorts of creativity, with other than human intelligences, and think about the ways that we treat other creatures, other landscapes, mountains, rivers, rocks, trees, as worthy of our respect and our honor and our reciprocity, and the mutual reciprocity between us. So they're relatives. So how does that perspective, when we really practice that perspective, how does that change how we interact with the world? How can we make that more a part of our everyday realities when we walk outside, out the door? How can we, by thinking of our kinship with this world, how can we begin to restore those relationships that have been frayed or fragmented? One word that came up in several of the essays in the book series was remembering. How do we remember, not just in terms of our cognitive abilities, but remember, like reactivate our membership into our home ecosystems by becoming good kin? So I think arguably, at least in my mind, one of the fundamental ruptures that we live in, that a lot of us live in, I should say, not all of us, is we have been separated or divorced from or orphaned from the lands that we live on. We aren't living with them, we're living on them. And so kinship was a real effort to once again recognize and use that theme as a focusing lens to say, how do we remember? How do we come back to our relatives? So that's one piece of it. And then, another thing that frequently came up in the book series was the idea of kinning, which takes that word that's usually a noun, kin, and makes it into a verb. And I think it's kinship is better thought of as a verb than it is a noun. It's an active orientation and engagement with the world. So, and that goes for the way that we characterize other species. Oftentimes, not just in scientific language, where a species might be given a number, but in conventional contemporary language, it's very common to, and I'm talking about the English language here because there is a contrast with a lot of indigenous languages and even other languages around the world. But in English, which is so noun heavy, the pronouns that are used for other species are often it. We'll say, look at it flying through the sky, or look at it crawling under the rock, and our children pick that up and they learn to think of other creatures as objects. And we also wanted to really push back against that and say, no, these are she's and he's and they's, and they are not objects. They are subjects of a life, as we are. And so as we relate to them as subjects, we are, and bring that into our lives and our hearts, our consciousness, then, and become other regarding in that sense, then that language correction, from it to a gendered pronoun or a non-binary pronoun, reminds us of our relations to these other subjects, that they're not simply objects or background or scenery in our worlds, which is so often how they are treated, but they are engaged and connected and have their own sensibilities and their own ways of navigating the world. And so, a fuller ethic or a fuller ecological ethic in the world requires that we not just look at other humans as potential kin, but look at non-human as potential kin. So those are a few thoughts about how we were framing this project and this book and what we were trying to put out there in the world to invite people to think about.
And this is like a little bit off the script, but it was occurring to me as you were speaking about these things. I was recently asked about when was your awakening and what was your awakening. I kind of hate that question, but I also think that it's interesting how it kind of relates to what you were talking about. And I was curious too, did you grow up with that sense of a knowledge or a feeling of being related to the world around you, or was that kind of cultivated in at some point in time? How did that happen?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because you will get like diverse answers from folks. Although, Gary Snyder, the poet, award-winning beat poet who has gone on to write just some incredible books, including The Practice of the Wild, he says kids are natural animists. And I think that that's probably true. Like, until we're sort of actively guided away from that sensibility by adults, who may be well-meaning or well-intentioned, but that we tend to approach the world as if it is alive, as if it does have certain claims on us, that that we treat those other animals as people, as in our worlds. And so, I'm sure it's different for everyone of when one starts to sort of separate from that. And maybe there's a healthy process, psychologically speaking, of individuation, that you need to go through, and then come back, to that perspective you had later on down the line. But I mean, for me, so I think that, that was just the natural way of being. And then, nature was always a place for me that I don't think would be wrong to use the word sacred. It was the place where I was humbled, where I was in awe of, what was around me. And I think that that's a thread that was pretty consistent in my life. And then, had a chance to flourish later on, as I had more say in what I did and where I went, and and all of that sort of thing. So I wouldn't say that there was any one awakening as much as there was just a sort of growing, encounters that fed maybe that natural animistic perspective.
Thank you for sharing that. Like you said, I think I do agree that like kids do have that natural sense. And maybe there is a healthy like you said, individuation process that you have to go through and kind of like form your own identity. And then, that all comes back to the relationship between the individual and the community, which that line has to be drawn, but also it has to be kind of a little bit of a blurry line. Anyway, that's a whole other can of
Yeah.
worms.
No, I know, but I appreciate that because I think that it is possible to just get stuck there, right? Like where you have such a strong sense of individuality that you don't recognize that our very bodies are comprised of all different types of, bacteria and fungi. And our reason for being here is the symbiotic merger of different forms of life, that led to our being. So the notion of even an individual is certainly a construct. I mean, I was reading this kind of wonderful piece by a scientist who was in a team of people who were making the case that, we are all, I don't think he used the word holobiont. I think that comes maybe from Donna Haraway, but he said we're all lichen, and lichen is this combination of algae and fungi that they each benefit and they become one organism, and to some degree we are all that, and we're all deeply dependent on the larger community of life. And so it's worth it's worth remembering that and not maybe getting too hung up on your own ego trip.
Yes, that's so true. And also a good way to segue into the third question, actually, on the topic of kind of giving life and being a part of life. So for me, and I guess for a lot of people who I'm assuming who when they think about spring, I think they think about that desire to give life and to be a part of life. And like we've been saying, it's kind of maybe inherent and natural to humans that we've kind of repressed and forgotten. But it is kind of in some ways inherent alongside our more than human kin. But I think so giving life is a very vague phrase and also can kind of be very badly misconstrued and also used by people who don't necessarily mean as well. And so I kind of wonder how you understand that idea of giving life and how we kind of might practice it. How do you see that as a guiding principle, if it should be? Kind of an open question, but
Yeah, no, it's a good question because, I mean, in Buddhist terms, the prevention or the lessening of suffering is often given as a kind of primary motive. And that's kind of a negative way of phrasing it. So the positive way of saying it is how do we increase the well-being around us, increase and give life, So I don't know, well, because it's maybe we're doing a seasonally themed thing here on spring, the first thing I think of is I used to be part of a community garden. I had this little plot that was kind of badly positioned to where it didn't get maybe as much sun as it should. And I was not out there nearly enough to really watch and maintain and cultivate the seeds that I planted. And so things got really scraggly really quickly. And then the deer got into the garden and ate the stuff so I got very little out of the garden, with the original purpose of the garden being, to bring home some, fresh vegetables and things like that. So that was off the table. But with the deer and the rabbits and the chipmunks and the squirrels and getting the choice morsels that I was able to even manifest out of the out of the garden, at a certain point, the purpose of that garden changed for me. And I began to think of it as a wildlife donation. So rather than it being for my family's table, it was just kind of bringing more food into the neighborhood for the animals that already lived there. So that's like one thing, one form of giving life. But another thing that occurred to me was, I don't know how familiar people are with ecological restoration, but the basic idea here is that there are certain native species to any place that oftentimes are beleaguered because other plants have overgrown them. They blocked out the light. The aggressive invasive species are very good at entering into damaged habitat and kind of taking over and thus decreasing the diversity of that place. So a kind of spring cleaning exercise is that you clear those other species out so that the light can again reach the forest floor and the seeds that are lying dormant there. And I think it makes a kind of nice metaphor for our own lives, for being self-reflective, to look at what needs cleaning, what needs our attention, what can we let go of, what's not necessary, to stop every once in a while and be able to evaluate that in ourselves is an act of allowing those seeds within us that have been dormant, the space to grow and thrive. So that's another way of giving life, I think. And then maybe one final thought is springtime is a time of migration and living flows of creatures, especially birds, but in the area where I live is an area where monarch butterflies overwinter. So they collect in the thousands in certain spots along the coast here. And it's really a phenomenal thing to witness. But I think the lesson here, if there is one, is that we can provide habitat for species on their journeys, on their long migrations. And that is a form of giving life, whether it's the simple act of planting milkweed for monarchs or other plant species that are food sources for them. It requires us knowing the needs of other species and then adjusting our own behaviors to meet those needs. And the cool thing about that is that can happen not just in rural areas or areas that are considered wild or more natural, but having lived in the Chicago area, there are huge efforts underway for people just to plant backyards, vacant lots, discarded and disregarded pieces of land with those native plant species, where they become the word that's used is refugia. They literally become a refuge for these other species on their journeys. So I think that's a pretty powerful way to think about how we might participate and contribute to giving life and giving aid and refuge to other species.
I love those ideas, and also the invitation to people who are also living in like highly urbanized and city places. They too can participate in this process of giving life. And it's not just that you have to up and move. Urbanized places also need that kind of care and that kind of rewilding. Again, off the script, but I think I want to kind of go into that a little bit. When you were talking about invasive species, that's always a very thorny topic that
Maybe
I'm
literally.
interested in. Yeah, it is. I wonder how you think about that. So a recurring theme in a few of the conversations on this podcast series is the idea that there's no good or like bad. Well, people fall on different ends of the spectrum for this, but like some people position invasive species as like unwanted things that we should get rid of. But then there are also other people who will say that that's a new ecosystem and a new community that's like forming. And there are like ways that I can see this beyond more than human worlds and into thoughts about human communities and how they move around and migrate and shift and things like that. But just kind of wondering what your thoughts on that is, on what might be arising for you.
Yeah, it's a big topic, and I won't be able to do it nearly the justice that it deserves, but I can offer up a couple of thoughts and we'll see where it takes us. So I mentioned earlier that one of the ways that invasive species kind of thrive oftentimes is in very disturbed environments that we have disturbed, whether it's paving these places over or whether it's just trashing, disregarding their overall health, whatever it is. Oftentimes those invasive species do the service of really coming in, stabilizing the soil, keeping it from eroding away. There's a lot of things that can happen there. And plus, there should be also an acknowledgement that there's a spectrum. Some species which are invasive might actually naturalize quite well and not cause any damage to the larger ecosystem. In fact, might serve the function of, like, there are some invasive species that become food sources for bird life, for instance, that they wouldn't otherwise have it there, and they make use of it. So there's that going on as well. But I think the thing to consider and to always bear in mind is sort of like, what's the overall health of the system and the overall diversity of the system, and have that as kind of a benchmark for sort of what you're aiming for when you're trying to do acts of ecological restoration. And one thing that I think is also important to bear in mind is to have a kind of humility to what you're doing. Like, and if you are removing other plant species or even animal species, then to not do it cold-heartedly or mechanically. A lot of times I think we rationalize our behavior, because it's hard. We're taking life when we do that. And so to somehow honor, if you have to do that, if you have to participate in that, or if you feel like it's necessary for the sustenance and the well-being of the overall system, then to not do it without careful consideration and concern and honor for those species that have moved in, to find a way to do it with some sort of gratitude and respect for why they're there, how they've been there. Yeah. So those are a couple of thoughts, but yeah, I think you're right in sort of raising the caution or concern that the kind of language can easily bleed into human to human metaphors and actualities where people are being treated as something that should be removed. And I mean, when you think of humans, I mean, it's very, in the United States at least, if you're not a native person, then we are, in a sense, all European descended peoples are invasive. So bear that in mind when you're throwing around those kinds of terms, that there can be some negative and nefarious overlap. Again, take care, with how we use our language and how we use our hands, really, when we're thinking about ecological restoration.
Yeah, good words of caution to remember. Let's kind of move into a different space. So thinking about the trickster, the reason why I wanted to bring this in was because I think want to honor the fact that like people might be coming into this season not with always like an open mind, and like not everyone is feeling very excited or like renewed coming into this new season. People might be bringing mixed emotions, maybe with like pain and grief, or like a sense of clarity, disillusionment with the current moment. I wanted to ask how you think that the trickster's energy might give us some wisdom or like pathways as we shift into this kind of new time, and also beyond that as well.
What is the trickster? What's the creature you associate with the trickster? I'm curious. The reason I ask is because the trickster archetype, it's in many different cultures, and the trickster just sort of changes clothes and shape. But the main thing about this entity, this trickster archetype, though, is like that they're boundary crossers, that they play with social conventions, and they sometimes are bad examples, to kind of show what you should be doing is not what the trickster is doing, but, from the Greeks, they had Hermes, who was known as Mercury, the messenger god. And for the Romans, for the Norse, it's Loki. There's Ishu in West Africa, who Bayo Komolafe writes very eloquently about. For the Lakota, it's Iktomi, the spider. In the Midwest, the tribes often had the rabbit as a trickster, and there's some of that in American folk tales that had, trickled into American folk tales, or even Looney Tunes like Bugs Bunny, right? Like he's kind of a trickster archetype himself. So, and then Raven is a very prominent one in the Pacific Northwest. But for me, probably the most notorious one, at least in North America, is Coyote. And this kind of intelligence, but goofiness, adaptability in particular, I think are the actual creature has these that are then taken up into these oral narratives of Coyote. And, at least one author claimed that Coyote is the oldest deity in North America in that sense, or we could say figure or spirit might be better than deity, as part of these trickster tales. And I think Coyote is a good one. It was, at least for me, because when I was living in the Chicago area, we had couple thousand coyotes that were roaming through Chicago that not everybody knows about, but you'll see them sometimes, at in the cemetery, or at night crossing the street, or walking alongside the train tracks, the metro tracks. And to me, it was very appropriate that Coyote, as this trickster figure, was now in our urban areas in the United States, because the adaptability of actual coyotes, biological coyotes, like fit really well with the symbol of trickster, and how muddying these boundaries between nature and culture, between the urban and the wild. And so coyote was in our midst, muddying those boundaries, that those conceptual boundaries that oftentimes we create dualities or bifurcations between human artifacts or cultural human culture and those of other animals. And coyote just came right into the city and sort of playing with that in a way. So I don't know if that necessarily answers the question about like what we're doing with grief, but and how the trickster can help with that. But I think one thing the symbol of the trickster can make us aware of is when social convention has become deadening, when we are locked into a certain way of thinking or a certain societal way of doing things. Trickster is often associated with the crossroads where two paths meet. Again, the boundary, right? So we're at a kind of crossroads in certain ways, right now, in terms of, climate change, and in terms of disregard for our non-human kin, in terms of sort of white supremacy culture that has reared its head in so many ways in the last few years. In my mind, those are social conventions that need to be challenged, and that an archetype like the trickster guides us, in that way, in a certain sense, to challenge those conventions, to recognize them as the way things are being done, but not the way things have to be done. Right? So trickster is always disruptive force that is always showing that the boundaries that we think are solid are not. So we live in a time that I think is ripe for that trickster archetype, and can help us think about how do we enact new ways of being, and how can we move into unconventional possibilities and open the space of our imagination. How can we literally think outside of the boxes that we've put ourselves and others into? I think that's the role of the trickster.
I love that. Thank you for sharing so many examples with us. I'm kind of called to invite people who are listening to this to find the trickster in your neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
or around you. I mean, I think a lot of like more than human can probably fall in that category of trickster, whatever that may be, whatever kind of stands out as like a trickster, and whether that's kind of a story, a mythology from your culture, or just something that, like I said, it's like in your neighborhood, and that might give people a sense of renewed energy, hopefully appropriate amount of disruption. To shift into a closing, I would love for you to share a few offline or embedded in the earth practices for listeners to try out. Very simple practices can be very eye-opening. So yeah, would love for you to
Yeah,
share some.
totally. Yeah, well, we can start there, because I appreciate what you said about simple practices. And I think it's really important, that you don't mistake that you have to do these big grand gestures and have these life transformative experiences that are super dramatic. And, it's as close to us as our feet, right? As just walking and falling into rhythm, our own pace, with a kind of natural rhythm that our body has as we walk. I think the phrase Diogenes, Greek philosopher, said solvitur ambulato, if I'm pronouncing the Latin correctly, which is it is solved by walking. And it might not be that we take a question out with us and get an answer, but we're, at least there is a kind of, in the physical motion of walking, there's also a kind of, where we can turn things over slowly and reflect on things. Again, that sort of sense of pace. And so I do like to walk, and I like to walk as much as I can. And in part, that's just a matter of me putting my body out where I can have encounters, where I can be open sort of sensorially to the world. If I can go barefoot, I will, because there's a sort of feeling the world from the ground up, the tactile sense of being alive and being in the midst of other forms of life, that is refreshing, is almost underselling it, because it is a larger connection. When we think of our bodies as an instrument, or as a medium to receive and to be receptive to the world around us, we're no longer thinking of ourselves as separate from the world around us, but we are actually sort of exquisitely designed to receive through all our senses what's going on, the larger conversation that we're a part of. So if I have advice to give about walking, it's a very simple thing, and that would just be slow down. It's not as important to get from point A to point B as it is to be present to yourself, to what's around you, to where you are. Thich Nhat Hanh has this nice little pass. He was one who the practice of walking was very important to him. He's comes out of the Buddhist tradition, but he would just say, one of the phrases he said is, whenever you step down, you can pause every so often and say, I have arrived, I am home. So in other words, our destination isn't necessarily like up the mountain or over the hill or thousands of miles or whatever this long journey. It might be, but it's good to reflect every once in a while that we are already where we need to be. We are already at home in the world. So I think about that sometimes. I think another thing that can be paired with that kind of walking is just an awareness of one's own breathing, because breathing is our reciprocal act with the world, with the plantkin that we share this world with. So we're literally taking in what they're giving out, and we are giving out what they're taking in. And in that act, if you can become a little bit more conscious of it or a little bit more aware of it, that sort of deep reciprocity that allows us to even be alive can fill one with a sense of gratitude. And so sometimes I'll say, when I'm breathing out, I'll say you, and then when I'm taking in, I'll say me, and then I'll say we. So this is a we thing. Like, it's not just us walking out there, it's not just us breathing, but we are participating in this. And so those simple bodily awareness of walking and breathing as a reciprocal act, I think, bringing that into our consciousness reminds us that there's nothing that's inanimate, that this world, and there's nothing that's just background, that we are literally ingesting and inhaling the world, and we are in turn giving back. So it's kind of a fundamental relation that we have. So that's walking. The other little thing that I just kind of want to throw out there is just to ask folks, when was the last time you slept outside? And I don't just mean camping. I mean, laid back in the grass and just like took a nap. Like, when was the last time you stared up at the clouds through the flutter of leaves and tree limbs and let your head rest on the earth, not just your feet? Who knows what dreams arise out of those experiences. So those are some things to think about as we're urged out the door by our bodies as spring, comes into, and the sun is shining more often now. I just encourage people to give in to that urge, and then really treat their body as a receptive instrument to what's going on around them.
What's coming up for me in response to that is, I was just thinking about Sharon Blackie's, her whole idea of kind of listening to the land streaming. Yeah, when you said like what kind of dreams may arise, that was immediately what my mind went to. And kind of, I guess, like lying down, or not necessarily even lying down if that's not something that people are able to do. It's like just kind of like being in the midst of nature in whatever form and looking up through the canopy and being a part of that. And then, yeah, like listening to the land streaming. Those are really great practices. I hope people try them out. It's just a different way of approaching things that people are already doing. Like taking a walk and breathing are all simple practices that we're already doing on the daily. It's just about how we open our senses to receiving more from the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so to tie into the theme of rebirth and to really close, I'm wondering if you could maybe read us something that either you wrote, something you read that is related to the theme, and that will leave us for the entire series.
For sure. If you'll allow me, I will read two things, if that's okay. I'm going to circle back to where we began this conversation and when we were talking about remembering, because I read Joy Harjo's poem, Remember, and I thought immediately, this has to be part of the Kinship series if I can get her permission to use it. And I pursued it and we got permission, and it's the first poem in the first volume. So it kind of kicks off the series in a way. But I think it's a really nice reminder of the kinship themes, but also this idea of remembering. So I'm going to read that to you, and then I have something of my own that I'll close with. So this is Joy Harjo. Poem is called Remember. Remember the sky you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away to night. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life, who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe. Remember you are all people and all people are you. Remember you are this universe and this universe is you. Remember all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember language comes from this. Remember the dance language is, that life is. Remember. So that's Joy Harjo. And then I thought that it might be nice if I shared, it occurred to me that another sort of tying together of some themes, and it includes a little reference to one of my favorite poems by Robinson Jeffers, a poem called Return, which is very sort of synchronous with this idea of rebirth or spring, you know, and the return of the sun and the light and our attendance to it. So for a little context for this, I'm just going to read you a short excerpt. It's a piece I wrote about my time in the Andrews Forest in the state of Oregon. It's a forest that includes a lot of old growth. So it's Doug firs and huge trees, beautiful variety of trees, but dominated by these Doug fir trees that stretch vertically so high that, you know, your neck begins to hurt, you know, after you're there for a while, because you're always like looking up at the tree canopy. And while I was there, I was thinking about this relationship between when words were helpful and when words began to get in the way of experience. And so I'll read you, I think the passage will be maybe self-explanatory, but it's the close of this piece. And it goes like this. If words can do something, if they can sink into the heart, open up new paths of perception, lead us to the threshold of a forest, this is all to the good. Then we must leave them. They've done their work. They got our bodies where they needed to be. At this threshold, we must thank them for their service and lay them down. It is time to stop speaking and listen. Come to the trees to forget and to remember. To forget the straitjackets of manufactured time and cubicles. To remember something much older than the Gregorian calendar and the 40-plus hour work week. Come to the trees to touch and be touched by something more primary, more whole. Among my favorite Robinson Jeffers poems is one called Return. In it, he writes, I will touch things and no more thoughts, comparing the continuous intellectual chatter in our brains to the breeding of, quote, mouthless mayflies darkening the sky, end quote. Things and no more thoughts, he pleads. Leave the words behind, even if you're compelled to write a poem about it later. I lift my forehead from the Douglas fir, eyes closed. Inhale, earth, green. Exhale, bark, hummus. Inhale, light, needles. Exhale, dark, roots. Inhale, hum, silence. I take a few backward steps to better crane my neck upward and follow the lines of grooved bark into the sky. Before leaving this grove on the Discovery Trail, I kneel before the Douglas fir that towers above the circular clearing. I do this without thinking. It is a response, a gesture useless to the market, a way of communicating what remains now that words have slipped away. If humans fall on their knees in the woods and there is no one there to hear, do they make a sound? So
Thank
that's
you.
that.